Hi, Richard.
We may need to do something before the Prime Minister comes on because there's an echo. Something is echoing back whenever there's communication between yourself and other persons.
All right, I'll try to see what can be done.
Do you have two devices on, Mr. Prescott?
No, I have one device.
Hello.
Honorable Prime Minister, good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon. Good evening.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to see you. So, the Honorable Prime Minister is here, and so we will commence our lecture this afternoon immediately with some brief introductory remarks. So, good evening, everyone, and happy Mashramani to those in Guyana and those joining us from Guyana. Today we celebrate our Republic anniversary, so I want to ensure to time out to acknowledge that and to trust everyone would have had a great day thus far. Now, this lecture forms part of our course BYD 2203 called Contemporary Issues in Youth Development. And this course explores main debates and issues of concern to Caribbean youth development work. Students are expected to demonstrate an understanding of the complex, interrelated themes of development, which impinge on youth development, and be able to offer critical analysis of current issues affecting youth, such as globalization and migration, poverty, socioeconomic development, and other issues. It is against this backdrop, Honorable Prime Minister, the request is made for you to be our guest lecturer this evening, and we so readily accept, and we are certainly grateful for that. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a distinct honor to have Dr. the Honorable Ralph Gonsalves, Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, to grace us with his presence this evening. Prime Minister Gonsalves has served as chair of the Conference of Heads of Government several times during his tenure as Prime Minister, and his presence this evening is a testimony to his commitment to regional and youth development. Just before I give the floor to whom many refer to as Uncle Ralph, and more recently the five-star general, having won 5 consecutive victories at the polls in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I wish to acknowledge the presence of the Chancellor and Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of Guyana, Professor Edward Green and Dr. Melissa Eisel, respectively, other faculty leaders, the course coordinator, Mr. Will Campbell, lecturer at the University of the West Indies, Dr. Arlette St. Bill and her students, and the other students who are the main beneficiaries of tonight's lecture. Professor Edward Green will now bring brief introductory remarks before the Prime Minister takes the floor. Dr. Green?
Thank you very much. I wish to thank the faculty and staff and students of social sciences, and in particular those involved in the course on contemporary issues of youth development, for inviting me to participate in this lecture and bring introductory remarks. The invitation triggered memories of my introduction to Mona UWI. I arrived on that campus to take up my appointment as a junior research fellow in early October 1969. After putting my belongings down at my temporary lodgings, I was escorted across the campus by Professor Archie Singham, only to witness a huge gathering, spellbound by the oratorical skills of a young man whose demands for student rights resonated amid thunderous applause, while the then Vice Chancellor, Sir Roy Marshall, remained marooned in his car outside what was referred to as Senate House. Professor Singham explained that that young man was one of his students who had just graduated with a first-class honors and was also the recent past president of the Students' Guild. That student, as you may have guessed by now, is none other than my colleague and friend, Dr. the Honorable Ralph Gonsalves. I was to learn that he had also led the student march on the capital city, Kingston, a year before, that attracted widespread support in a protest against the government of Jamaica for the banning of the renowned Guyanese historian, Walter Rodney, for what was deemed to be subversive activity. Having just arrived from Trinidad and Tobago, where I witnessed the 1968 Black Power movement in full force and the involvement of student leaders, I was well aware of the power of youth leadership at the University of the West Indies. But what I witnessed in my first moments on the Mona campus convinced me that I was in the midst of something special. Ralph Gonsalves went on to gain his master's degree at Mona and a PhD at the University of Manchester, and was simultaneously called to the bar of Gray's Inn, London. This feat attested to both his intellectual as well as his fortitude as a human being. His professional trajectory included teaching stints at Makerere University in Uganda and UWI Cave Hill before returning to St. Vincent and the Grenadines to embark on a successful legal practice, and not surprisingly, turning attention to politics. But what was not foretold was that Ralph was to become the longest serving prime minister in the CARICOM region, with victories in 5 successive general elections spanning the past 20 years. Prime Minister Gonsalves would be the first to let you know that these successes were built on hard work, commitment, and resilience. I recall him telling me that during his early years as deputy leader and involvement with the trade union, he would turn up on a Saturday afternoon at a city park to make his political pitch to crowds of varying sizes, interests, and curiosity. It may have been a vanity of his to emulate Dr. Eric Williams's political debut at the University of Woodford Square in Port of Spain. But on a particular Saturday, as the story is told, having set up his soapbox and microphone, he was stunned that his only audience was a dog, lying, but seemingly in rapt attention. That he proceeded to make his case undaunted by the crowd size, illustrate the kind of indomitable will combined with a sense of humor that no doubt contributed to Prime Minister Gonsalves' amazing political longevity. But there's much more to Prime Minister Gonsalves. He emerged as a leading advocate for regional integration movement in its various forms, for the single market and economy, for the free movement of persons, for the Nassau Declaration, the health of the region is the wealth of the region, for the fight against HIV/AIDS, where he was designated a champion for change, for the establishment of the CARICOM Youth Ambassadors Program, now in its 20th year, for CARICOM's Reparative Justice Program, and for social justice for the Caribbean in this COVID era. His regional leadership included several rounds as chair of the OECS, of the CARICOM ACP Forum, CARI Forum, and of the CARICOM community. But among the I would call the crowning glories of PM Gonsalves' career is his piloting St. Vincent and the Grenadines to headline the Caribbean at the helm of global leadership at the United Nations. In January 2020, St. Vincent and the Grenadines signified the magnitude of its international status, the smallest country ever to sit on the Security Council, the highest UN organ. It is one of 10 non-permanent members of the Security Council, together with 5 permanent members. Prime Minister Gonsalves aptly described that moment as St. Vincent and the Grenadines representing the world, but with the geographic interest of the Caribbean civilization. Ladies and gentlemen, this is but a snapshot of the acclaim of this erudite champion of the Caribbean region in the international theaters. I have no doubt that this will be a delightful and uplifting engagement. Welcome to you, brother Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves.
Thank you very much, Eddie. I want to thank you, the University of Guyana, the students, the staff, and certainly Royal Prescott, who has been in touch with me to do this talk, to have this conversation on globalization and its connection and impact in the Caribbean and on the Caribbean. Just a couple of other things, Eddie. You have been very generous in your comments, but you omitted that in doing my master's at UWI, you were one of my 2 supervisors. You omitted that. And I want to say it was very delightful to have you help to mold me. And I've always appreciated that, and you know that. And secondly, you underestimated the size of the audience that particular evening of which you spoke. There was not only a dog, there was a fat woman and an old man, but the dog was the most attentive of my 3 listeners. but the sound was going inside of the homes. I spoke that evening for 3 hours. No one else. I set up the system on a 12-volt battery in my old Cortina 1970 Ford motor car, the steering wheel as tough as a truck. And it didn't have power steering. At least I couldn't afford one with power steering. That was a new phenomenon then. And at the end of the speech, the gentleman who had gone, who had seen me, because the other guys from my outfit didn't turn up for one reason or the other, but I held a meeting. So I was the chairman. I said the opening prayer. I was the first, second, third, and fourth speaker. And I did the doxology. And then I picked up the equipment. And by then, other people had come by and, fed me well. That particular area in my constituency, routinely, they give me 90%, 92% of the vote in that community, which have about 1,400 voters. So it has been a long journey. It is now, I've been a political activist for 53 years. So it has been my life work. And I have tried to stay faithful to certain basic ideas and ideals. And where I have had to make compromises, I have not been compromising. And the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and the region have been very good to me. and I thank them very much. And they have imbued me with a tremendous optimism. And in this, the autumnal stage of my career, I remember always, and I say this all the time, morning by morning, new mercies we see. All that we need, thy hand has provided. Great is thy faithfulness. I want to talk a little bit about globalization. And I prepared a paper, but I will speak, I'll read parts of it and I will speak in a freestyle way in other parts as the circumstances permit or admit. I don't know how much time we actually have, but I will want us to reserve some time for us to have some questions and to hear the comments of the young persons who are there at the University of Guyana and around the region. I understand that this talk is being streamed this evening on one of the TV stations in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And it's on Facebook, I've been told. So apparently it's going to get more coverage than I thought. Now, I want always to begin with a definition of globalization, but to start with the recognition at the outset that definitions are never really right nor wrong, only more or less useful. And I have a working definition of utility provided to us by the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And it's apt, it's relevant. And I'll just read it. Quote, globalization is the word used to describe the growing interdependence of the world's economies, cultures, and populations, brought about by cross-border trade in goods and services, technology, and flows of investment, people, and information. Countries have built economic partnerships to facilitate these movements over many centuries. But the term gained popularity after the Cold War in the early 1990s, as these cooperative agreements shape modern everyday life. The wide-ranging effects of globalization are complex and politically charged. As with major technological advances, globalization benefits society as a whole, while harming certain groups. Understanding the relative costs and benefits can pave the way for alleviating problems while sustaining the wider payoffs, unquote. The usefulness of this definition is constrained by the fact that the understandings of globalization and the drawing up of costs and benefits and the resolution of its challenges are not and can never be neutral as between contending classes, groups, or nations. And contained herein is the problematic of globalization. And of course, we know quite well that from time immemorial, individual explorers and traders and groups and nations have crisscrossed the boundaries of other nation states of the known areas of planet Earth to establish hegemony or empire. Noteworthy ones spring to mind: the Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Persian, and Chinese empires. But it is true to say that none of these empires created really a global interdependence of states and civilizations, or what we can call globalization. And arguably, there have been historically three or more less distinct eras of globalization. The first beginning in 1492, when Christopher Columbus made contact between the so-called Old World and the New World of the Americas in his pursuit of the Western route from Europe to India. And in the process, Columbus opened up trade and commerce, and a clash of civilization ensued between Europeans and the diverse indigenous nations of the sprawling Americas. In the wake of all this arose European conquest, settlement, colonization, native genocide, the enslavement of Africans, economic exploitation of the resources of the Americas, and the spread of national variants of European civilization, inclusive of its languages, institutions, customs, and diseases. This first phase of globalization lasted until around 1800. You can chop and change globalization in its historical context and put whatever phases you want. But I'm doing this in 3 phases for our analytic purposes here today. This first phase of globalization, as I said, lasted until around 1800. And this European-driven globalization rested upon mercantile capitalism and its evolution into industrial capitalism, underpinned by technological innovations which altered life, living, and production. Contending European nations were the dominant ones, Britain, Spain, France, and those of lesser magnitude, such as Portugal and Holland. The second phase of globalization, second distinct phase, lasted roughly for 200 years, from around 1800 to the year 2000. In this period, industrial capitalism metamorphosed in stages into global monopoly capitalism, in which industrial capital was conjoined with banking capital to create a pervasive finance capital linked to industrial production and the exploitation of natural resources and raw materials overseas. V.I. Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, accurately described in 1917 that this highest stage of monopoly capitalism was imperialism. In this second phase of globalization, momentous events of an historically defining nature occurred. The American Revolution of 1776 consolidated itself as the United States of America, which by the early 20th century had positioned itself to become the dominant global power in what can be called the long 20th century. The French Revolution of the 1790s exhausted itself and belched up Bonapartism, which collapsed as France groped towards the establishment of a democratic French Republic. The enslaved Africans in the Americas obtained their formal emancipation between 1838 and the 1880s, paving the way for momentous post-emancipation struggles for civil rights in the USA and political independence in Latin America and the Caribbean. The introduction of indentured labor into the Caribbean from Europe, India, and China, the imperial carving up of Africa by European nations in the late 19th century, and the establishment of colonial rule, including white settler dominance in Southern Africa, descending into a state-sponsored system of racial apartheid, European colonization of the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia, the intense European nation-state rivalries grounded in various national factions of monopoly capitalism and nationalist ideologies erupted into 2 world wars, 1914 to 1918 and 1939 to 1945, which drew the USA, China, and Japan into these global military ventures. The overthrow of the Tsarism in Russia by the Bolsheviks in 1917 and the establishment and consolidation of the Soviet Union, formerly under the ideological banner of Marxism-Leninism, as the global communist rival to the American-led world of monopoly capitalism. The rush to independence of European colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, beginning with that of India in 1947. The armed struggles for national liberation in parts of Asia, especially in Vietnam and in Africa, inclusive in Southern Africa, the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, its consolidation and emergence as a global power under the leadership of the Communist Party of China, the Cuban Revolution of 1959 and its consolidation as a socialist country, guided by Marxism-Leninism on the veritable doorstep of the USA, the unraveling and collapse of the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe in the early 1900s, the rise of a short-lived American triumphalism, and the trumpeted victory of Western democracy and monopoly capitalism, the enthronement of trade liberalization, the gradual then accelerated process of women's liberation, albeit still within patriarchal power relations, the elaboration of a universal package of economic policies known as the Washington Consensus, to be applied to all by the Bretton Woods institutions, and the unfolding of revolutions in biotechnology, information technology, and the knowledge economy. The date of the third distinct era of globalization, what we may call modern globalization, can be conveniently marked from the dawn of the 21st century. But clearly, its dramatic stirrings were emerging from the last decade or so of the 20th century. The full fruition of the revolutions in information technology, biotechnology, and the knowledge-based economy is on display, driven by an increased proliferation globally of monopolistic or oligopolistic transnational corporations. All this rests on a global capital accumulation process, which is increasingly divorced from the actual production of goods or services. This speculative casino capitalism, facilitated in its swift movement by modern information systems, reflects the financialization of the capital accumulation process, which, through excessive private debt, triggered the global economic meltdown of September 2008 in the USA and its metamorphosis into a global economic depression of historic proportions. At the same time, the solution to this unstable financial system was put upon the backs of ordinary people globally. Thus, excessive private debt in its failure was handed a socialized lifeline. Meanwhile, the twin of casino capitalism and unfair trade liberalization continued apace. And migration within and between countries accelerated. You would note that in each of these phases, the nature and character of the economy, the first phase, mercantile capitalism, evolving into industrial capitalism, and then industrial capitalism linking with banking capital to create finance capital and going overseas as monopoly capitalism. And then in the third phase, a further entrenchment of monopoly capitalism, information technology assisting in its acceleration overseas, and the development in recent times of the financialization of the capital accumulation process, which is considerably divorced in many respects from the actual production of goods and services themselves. And that's why you give rise to a lot of instability and derivatives and the like. So it's important that whatever is taking place and whatever the events which are occurring, I want always to remember and for us to realize that this doesn't rest on just words. It rests on the foundation of the nature and character of the system of capitalism has evolved first from mercantile capitalism right through to the present time of the most advanced form of monopoly capitalism and the financialization of the accumulation process overseas too. Modern globalization, more than at any period, is transforming not only the economies of the world, but whole societies. The transformation is occurring at a pace hitherto unknown. The globalization of information, the economy, commerce, and capital movements bring abundant new opportunities as well as threats, both with far-reaching implications for individuals and societies. Combined and marked uneven developments are taking place at the same time, creating abundant wealth and severe dislocations. And that's happening throughout the world, within the developed countries and also countries on the quote-unquote periphery, including in the Caribbean. In the immediate aftermath of the global economic depression of 2008 to 2009, and its continuing adverse impacts, the British monarch posed a plaintive query, Queen Elizabeth II. She asked this: did not anyone see this coming? She addressed a group of leaders, including economists. Well, hundreds of books and learned treatises have sought to answer this and related questions, without much success or agreement by academia, the pundits, and practitioners of business. Within the citadels of monopoly capitalism, economic and political crises mounted. Pain and suffering escalated. Portugal, Iceland, Greece, Spain, Italy, and the United Kingdom, among others, endured severe economic challenges from which full recovery is yet to come. Even in the USA, 50 million people, or roughly 15% of that country's population, went on food stamps as unemployment and economic dislocation soared. Even when growth returned, it was for a long time jobless by and large. By the unraveling of casino capitalism, trade liberalization, and globalization generally prompted spontaneous mass movements called Occupy New York, Occupy London, Occupy Athens, Rome, and Madrid. You may recall at this time, you would see, you can, those who are listening would remember the placards against the 99% against the 1%. The wealthy corporations were bailed out, but the people were not. All this and more caused resentments of one kind or another. In turn, these resentments gave rise to right-wing nationalist populism in Europe and elsewhere. It spawned Brexit in Britain, and the White House was thus delivered to Donald Trump against the expected political run of play. The handmaiden of this brand of right-wing populism was manifested as anti-immigrant, racist, and misogynist politics. Inevitably, a backlash or response came in the form of Black Lives Matter and a sharpened feminism, inclusive of a variant known as the Me Too movement. Trumpism unsettled aspects of the global project. Globalization demands an alive multilateralism. Trump extolled unilateralism, America first, and American hegemony. The Trump administration jettisoned sacrosanct trade agreements and tore up the free trade formulae, which it considered not sufficiently favorable to the USA. Trump himself blasted the World Trade Organization falsely for its alleged anti-American bias. Trump piloted a trade war against the European Union and China. He railed against NAFTA, Mexico, and Canada, and negotiated that North America Trade Pact. He withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord and the World Health Organization. He threatened to withdraw from NATO. He raised the specter of defunding the United Nations. He utilized an array of unjustified economic sanctions against Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran. And he weaponized the global financial system against perceived enemies around the world. He did all that. Still, the substance of the globalization project continued and indeed accelerated. So it doesn't matter that you have a political leader, even of with the power of the President of the United States. He may change certain things, but the fundamentals are remaining. And the globalization project continued and indeed accelerated. Information technology further developed extraordinarily. Artificial intelligence advanced unabated. Open sourcing, outsourcing, offshoring, supply chaining, insourcing, buzzwords of globalized activity grew massively as the circumstances warranted. And the formulations, digital, mobile, personal, and virtual, gripped the world in practice like never before. In fact, Trump lived on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and Instagram and so forth. But all of this, the consolidated and further deepening of globalization, has been put to the service in a highly skewed manner in favor of the dominant economic groups in the metropolitan countries of metropolitan centers of monopoly capitalism. Significant sections of the billion-plus population behemoths of China and India have prospered too. They are too large to be ignored. Their markets and resources are needed for the global project. And truth be told, every single economy and society across the globe has been touched or affected to a greater or lesser degree by the unleashed process of globalization arising from monopoly capitalism and its inherent insidious inequality between and within nations. Now, all of this, what I'm talking about here, you may be surprised to know that two writers, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, predicted all this in 1848 in the Communist Manifesto. I know nowadays, since the so-called triumph, defeat of centrally planned regimes, the Soviet Union, centrally planned regimes in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, that the people tell you, well, that's an indication that there's nothing Marx and Engels can write about which make any sense. But I want you to go to the Communist Manifesto of 1848. I'm not talking about the program in the Communist Manifesto, which is something of the left in the mid-European, the mid-19th century in Europe. I'm talking about the historical materialist analysis, the dialectical materialist analysis, as is evident in that document and in Marx and Engels' writings. And bear with me, I want to read something here which was written in 1848, 178 years ago. And I want you to tell me what you think of it. The prescience about globalization. Bear with me, it's a long quotation. Quote, all fixed, fast frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air, and all that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great chagrin of reactionaries, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations, by industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. In place of the old wants satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And this is 1848. And as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible. And from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst. That is, to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. Wow, 178 years ago. It's absolutely incredible. It's talking about what we're talking now about modern globalization. To be sure, Marx and Engels would not have been able to foresee the precise nature or specific contours of the revolutions in information technology, in communications, in industrial or digital technology, or in artificial intelligence. But they certainly foresaw the broad process of globalization arising from capitalist expansion at home and abroad. The optimism derived from this historical materialist analysis that this global process would finally unite working people to challenge successfully the bourgeois dominance and transform the production processes in the service of the people's socialized or communal purposes or interests is yet to be realized. Monopoly capitalism, modern globalization, under the direction of national fractions of the global bourgeoisie, have shown that it possesses a capacity to renew itself, enlarge the range of beneficiaries of the system itself, manage its sustenance over a prolonged period, and accommodate or co-opt alterations or even potentially hostile forces. In short, monopoly capitalism has been reasonably successful in resolving or at least muting its internal contradictions. The unanswered query is this: are there limits to its accommodation, co-option, or resolutions? Time will tell. But an ongoing struggle nevertheless ensues between competing forces and interests. If we look a little bit more in detail as to how this all played out, or how it plays out in the Caribbean. European conquest, settlement, and colonization of the Caribbean created, through the fever of history, economies and societies forged by way of globalization in its various phases. Our region's population mix of the offspring of indigenous peoples, this is after native genocide, Africans, Indians, Chinese, Europeans, and Arabs, have been fashioned through globalization. The creolization of our peoples, our reception of European languages and political institutions bear the hallmarks of a globalization grounded through the post-1492 years up to the present upon various stages: mercantile capitalism, industrial capitalism, variants of monopoly capitalism, and their attendant technological advances. In short, the Caribbean as we know it, it has been created through the various stages of globalization, created and consolidated. Many aspects of globalization are unavoidable, and the Caribbean can embrace and utilize. And so far, the Caribbean has been embracing and utilizing much of these to our advantage. Others are harmful and must be resisted, not through slogans and demagoguery, but by way of clear thinking and concerted action. Some features contain inevitably possibilities and limitations of our Caribbean civilization. Thus, our work is cut out to discern the benefits and burdens and act appropriately. A few examples will suffice to make the point. Let us take the case of the revolution in information technology and the spread and increased availability of information and knowledge. These interrelated phenomena have created, among other things, enhanced possibilities for knowledge, education, industry, tourism, commerce, offshore financial services, agriculture, fisheries, medical cannabis, travel, health, care, music, entertainment, and the linking more profoundly of our nation at home and in the diaspora. At the same time, however, this explosion of information threatens to swamp the cultural identity of our civilization by the homogenizing cultural push from our giant neighbor to the north-northwest, and to undermine our moral fabric by the excessive vulgarity and crassness of much of popular American culture. Similarly, trade liberalization in this new epoch contains benefits and burdens for the Caribbean. The dismantling of the region's protective trading regime for bananas and sugar in Europe has caused enormous dislocation in our economies, which have brought, in turn, immense economic hardships, in some cases poverty, to hitherto self-sufficient families of farmers, workers, and managerial personnel. Yet at the same time, trade liberalization has opened up niche markets for Caribbean designers, artists, musicians, and products, and has put the Caribbean in a very competitive position for the delivery of international financial services. That competitive position in the latter regard, however, has been eroded in recent years by a veritable pincer movement in the North Atlantic. The Europeans are aggressively emphasizing, in theory and practice, that the international financial services sector in our region constitute harmful tax regimes. And the Americans are focusing on alleged money laundering and the financing of terrorism through the financial services sector. Both Europe and America have been taking retaliatory action through blacklisting, threats of financial sanctions, the curtailing of correspondent banking relations, and the like. Those countries which embark upon the sale of passports and citizenship are also earmarked for possible sanctions additionally. The very global architecture of finance and monopoly capitalism contains two possible benefits and threats to our region. Easier availability of capital on commercial terms are in the offing, provided that the country's fiscal and debt sustainability so permit. But the unstable and inadequately regulated financialization of monopoly capitalism create huge downside risks for our region, as was evident in the post-2008 global economic depression, not of our region's making. That global financial and economic meltdown affected adversely our Caribbean economies, our banking and insurance systems, and our region's financial sustainability, for instance, took a massive hit with the knock-on collapse of the regional insurance giants, CLICO and BICO. And then globalization brings in its train with an immediacy to us in the Caribbean, the deleterious impacts of climate change, inclusive of global warming, and the spread of infectious disease such as the COVID-19 pandemic. None of these is of our own making, but we find ourselves on the front line of globalization's hubris and its discontents. In all this to and fro on globalization, two opposed schools of thought and action have emerged in the Caribbean regarding our strategic and tactical responses to this phenomenon. One is to surrender. The other is of resistance, creative responses, and the ennobling of our Caribbean civilization. Essentially, the advocates of the surrender or rollover and play dead option stress that the region is incapable of resisting globalization and its effects, good and bad. Thus, they conclude that the Caribbean civilization should surrender its independence, in fact, if not in name, its autonomy, its right to development, its political and cultural space, its right to self-determination and its sovereignty, and allow the United States of America and other advanced industrialized countries of the West to remake us in their own image and likeness. This school of thought and action has found support among rapacious, unpatriotic sections of the professional class and the business community, sections of them. And those elements among youths who thrive on frivolities, and we have some youths who are like that, hustling and imitative lumpen behavior fashioned in the ghettos of North America. In countering the ravages occasioned by aspects of globalization from outside and the veritable domestic cancer bred by those who raise the flag of surrender from inside, we cannot say simply, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That too would be an evangelism of surrender. The alternative path is one based on a culture of resistance and creative building of our society, economy, and civilization. This culture of resistance and creative construction of our socioeconomic apparatuses must be grounded in more than what the economic and political theorists and practitioners offer. We must go to the collective wisdom of the folk, the creative imagination of our people and their artists, poets and novelists, the tried and tested values which have come from the bowels of the people, and the abundant social capital which resides in our people. We have not sufficiently listened to them, and even when we have done so, we have failed to act appropriately. Modern globalization demands that we in the Caribbean focus on smart and disciplined work. It is vital that we engender new and more productive attitudes to work and production. I've been talking this for years, since I'm in the opposition in government. There are some people who think if you tell people they have to work in a more disciplined way and smarter, that you would lose votes. On the contrary, you have to put things in place to ensure that you have an education revolution so we can work smarter and to inculcate greater discipline in accordance with certain tried and tested values of our Caribbean civilization. And this, we can't resist the worst aspects of globalization while taking advantage of the quote unquote beneficial aspects. Without we work hard, smart, and disciplined. You know, the story is told that a few days after China formally joined the World Trade Organization, on December the 11th, 2000, that's when they joined. The Chinese manager of a fuel pump factory in Beijing posted an African proverb translated into Mandarin with a telling, compelling message. This is what the proverb says in English. Every morning in Africa, a gazelle wakes up. It knows it must run faster than the fastest lion, or it will be killed. Every morning, a lion wakes up. It knows it must outrun the slowest gazelle, or it will starve to death. It doesn't matter whether you're a lion or a gazelle. When the sun comes up, you better start running. That is what we have to be doing in the Caribbean. The engendering of new and better attitudes to work and production is at the core of what is called social capital, so vital to the stock of what the economists call total factor productivity, TFP, that difficult to measure leftover or residue in the production process after account has been taken of the inputs, that is the factors of production, land, labor, and capital. This TFP, total factor productivity, is simply the efficiency with which inputs are used. Initially, some experts considered that the increase in output per unit of input was simply due to technological progress, the know-how utilized. But clearly, it is more than this. It is not only know-how, it is also know why, know what, and know when. A composite of human capital within a wider matrix of social capital beyond culture, narrowly defined. This social capital in our Caribbean is of paramount importance to an optimal response to globalization, both in our accommodation of aspects of it, our creative resistance to undesirable elements in it, and our consequential strategic thrust and appropriate action plan, or homegrown developmental narrative. Francis Fukuyama, in an insightful book entitled The Great Disruption, Human Nature and the Reconstruction of Social Order, offers an apt definition of social capital. He avers that social capital is, quote, a set of formal, informal values, norms shared among members of a group that permits cooperation among them. If members of the group come to expect that others will behave reliably and honestly, then they will come to trust one another. Trust is like a lubricant that makes the running of any group or organization more efficient. That which is true for the family, group, or organization is also true in this regard for the society as a whole. Social capital possesses two broad dimensions: civic social capital and governmental social capital, both of which will cushion or save us from any debilitating ravages of globalization in its economic, financial barrages. Civic social capital is resident in the uplifting values, attitudes, norms of behavior at the individual, community, and societal levels. Government social capital embodies the democratic and rules-based ethos of our constitutional order, as reflected in representative and responsible government. An independent judiciary, a professional public service, devoid of partisan political conduct, a set of meaningful participatory civic arrangements, openness and transparency, the protection of individual rights and freedom, a mature regionalism and an alive multilateralism based on international law and practice, so as to avoid hegemony, unilateralism, and subservience to powerful states or corporations. Civic social capital and governmental social capital are core ingredients for the further ennoblement of our Caribbean civilization, the upholding of which, in both its formal and informal apparatuses, is an antidote to an unmanaged process of a rampaging globalization. It is a challenging issue of the highest order. Our success in this regard is not assured, but we have a fighting chance. This brings into focus our region's right to development in response to the hegemony or dominance of a unipolar-centered globalization. In the 5th Sir Arthur Lewis Memorial Lecture on November the 8th, 2000, the esteemed political economist Carrie Levitt, in reflecting on the right to development, addressed this issue thus, quote, "Has globalization made it impossible for developing countries to chart their own path to development, according to their endowment of human and natural resources, cultural and institutional heritage, and social imagination? If so, people and societies comprising 80% of the world's population will have to reclaim spaces of policy and autonomy to exercise the right to development. It is time to reclaim the right of nations to policy autonomy, the right to make the best use of one's resources, and the right to engage in the international economy on one's own terms. This requires an international rules-based order which permits space for developing countries to follow different and divergent paths to development according to their own philosophies, institutions, cultural and societal priorities. Kyrie Levitt then proceeded to sketch an alternative perspective of much relevance to us. Finance must be subordinate to the productive economy, globally and nationally. The productive economy must provide the basic needs of the entire population in an integrated society where there is not one economy for the privileged and another for the poor. Poverty alleviation is no substitute for development as a social project of all citizens. Economic growth must be subordinate to long-term sustainable development. Private profitability criteria are inappropriate for the provision of universally available education, educational, health, and other essential public services. All modern economies are mixed economies, combining the private sector, state enterprise, self-employment, and diverse forms of cooperative and associational community economic organization. Democracy and pluralism imply diversity of social and economic organization of societies. For peoples and nations, as for individuals, the right to development is ultimately the right to be autonomous, the right to be free, the right to the fruits of individual and collective work, and the right to live in harmony in a society of peace and mutual support and respect. The revolution in communication and information has diminished distance and speeded time. We know more about what is happening to other peoples in other countries. Although the Caribbean has always been connected with the four corners of the world by the diasporas of the past, which created these unique societies, and the diasporas of our times, which have enriched many countries and societies by the presence of Caribbean people and their descendants. In that sense, globalization is neither new nor menacing. What is menacing is the tide of global finance, which is sloshing in and out of currency and securities markets in search of short-term gains, with no responsibility for the fate of the majority of people who gain no benefits but pay the costs of this casino capitalism. There is no limit to the damage that international finance can inflict on an economy. Even the most successful countries have been brought to their knees by changes in market sentiment. The first requirement to restoring the right to development is the establishment within the United Nations system of a multilateral world financial authority to track, oversee, and regulate global financial markets on principles which restore market risk to creditors and limit the socialization of private guaranteed debt. All of this of Kyrie Levitt I agree with. She goes on to say, the IMF should return to its original mandate to provide medium-term finance for countries with temporary balance of payment problems. This would enable them to undertake adjustment without deepening a crisis by restrictive monetary and fiscal measures, which have long-term effects in eroding social infrastructure. The right to impose capital control should be reaffirmed, and initiatives to bind countries to capital account liberalization suspended. All official debt to poor countries should be cancelled, and financial restitution made to sub-Saharan Africa for slavery, colonialism, and the imposition of inappropriate programs and policies by the IMF and World Bank in the past 2 decades, and also reparations for native genocide and enslavement of Africans in our Caribbean. Development assistance should not be conditional on trade and investment liberalization and should be extended to borrowing countries as grants or soft loans to finance free, universal elementary education and primary health care. The World Bank should be brought under the direction of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, which must be strengthened and reformed to accord with democratic realities of the 21st century. Nothing less can assure peace, which is the ultimate prerequisite of development. Developing countries must have an effective voice in the making and the implementation of the rules of the WTO, which should be restricted to trade in its conventional sense, with no extension into trade-related matters. And Levitt concludes her analysis by saying, because it is obvious that small countries can only implement self-reliance policies in the context of larger regional entities, all barriers to regional economic integration of developing countries would be eliminated from the rules of the WTO, and provision for special differential treatment substantially lengthened to enable developing countries to transfer their economies to be less reliant on exports, which impoverish people and the environment, or on destabilizing private financial inflows as a substitute for a high rate of domestic savings and progressive and equitable taxation. Regional monetary arrangements for mutual assistance should be encouraged. There's one matter remaining: the impact of globalization, including information technology, and the role it has played in the breaking down of hierarchies in organizations, in families, and in societies. And we must not be afraid of this breakdown of hierarchies. We must accommodate it and accept it as something which is not undesirable. But we must ensure that in these new paradigms, there are clear rules and structures and norms must evolve to accommodate this breakdown in the hierarchy. So you don't have a normless situation, because if you have that, you'll have complete chaos. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, our efforts have been made, and I can talk about this more, by articulating in our government a people-centered vision, apply social democracy to our own condition, to uplift a socio-cultural matrix for the further ennoblement of our Caribbean civilization, to have as our strategic economic quest that to build a modern, competitive, many-sided post-colonial economy, which is at once national, regional, and global, which each of those words pregnant with real meaning, and to elaborate in theory and practice a mature regionalism, and to build an efficacious, independent, pragmatic foreign policy, and around those principles to set out detailed policies and programs accordingly. That is what I have to say on the subject. Thank you very much. I invite your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Honorable Prime Minister. Much appreciated. Before we go to the questions quickly, certainly appreciated how you defined and sort of outlined a conceptual framework, and perhaps highlighted some of the problematics of globalization. But even more importantly, describing the processes and motivations of globalization, as well as the outcomes and impact of it. But perhaps the more things change, the more they remain the same. As you read that quote from 148 years ago, and it seems that not much
178 years, 1848, 178 years.
178 years. Not much has changed. But looking more inward, I'm thinking of how economic and political union with COVID-19 are looking more inward for their success, economic and otherwise, and thinking how greater prosperity for our region lies in greater integration within the region and of the world. And of course, with that, we'll experience both opportunities and challenges. I think Bob Marley has a quote that says, the truth is, everybody's going to hurt you. You just have to find the ones worth suffering for. And I think perhaps when we think of the challenges and opportunities of globalization and the decisions we make within our foreign policy and so on, we can't avoid some of the pitfalls, and we then have to decide which one is worth suffering for. And I'm thinking about speeding up the Caribbean and running, and I think we have done well as a region. If we turn to Jamaica, using both 9.58, I think we're not too far off in terms of what we can do. But I'm not going to talk so much about the graduation of countries, the middle income status using a per capita income formula. So that's a challenge for us, and blacklisting, and the need for fresh global consensus on the classification of middle income countries, including SIDS in the Caribbean. I think of Guyana and St. Vincent and the Grenadines holding these key positions at the UN and demonstrating that we can definitely punch above our weight. And again, that size is no indication of anyone or a nation's ability to meaningfully contribute to the global agenda and become part of the solution to the challenges confronting the world currently. So I think as you're summing up there, there are challenges with globalization, especially for small countries, but just needing the assurance and the safeguards in place to create some level of equal footing. Those are some comments I wish to make now, and I am going to open the floor and persons can raise their hand. I'm not too sure if Dr. Green is still in, if he wants to make a comment before I go to Dr. Arla Kendall from the University of West Indies. All right. While Dr. Green is preparing, Dr. Sindel, can you hear me, and do you have a comment or question for the Honorable Prime Minister?
Good evening, and thank you so much for inviting us to this session this evening. It was a very, very well detailed, the historical depth that the Honorable Prime Minister went through was considerable. I have two questions, if you'll permit me. The first is around what is the CARICOM, how is CARICOM from your perspective, Dr. Gonsalves, what do you see as has been the benefits as far as dealing with these varied and changing issues over the past, as you outlined it, more than 500 years? More recently, what would you consider would have been the approach of CARICOM, and has it met expectations, and where do we need to go next? And I want you to kind of frame your point from the perspective of university students who are now, like you were, in Jamaica and thinking about master's and PhD research. What do you see as the next big social project, if you were to give guidance to those who have joined us this evening? Where do you think they should be? What should they be thinking about? What direction should they be going in? That's question number two. So the first one is, what has been CARICOM as far as the regional integration project in dealing with these issues? What would you consider have been the strengths? Have we met expectations? Where do we have to go? And number two, for the young male and female Dr. Ralph Gonsalves who are in the Zoom room today and listening on YouTube, what social projects, what social research should they be thinking about as they start getting ready for this new phase of globalization, modern globalization that we're in?
Before I speak to some of the things which CARICOM has been doing of value in my mind, I want to begin by reminding us what CARICOM is about. First of all, CARICOM is a community of sovereign states and territories. And I say territories there because Montserrat is a territory as part of CARICOM. But it's a community of these states CARICOM is not a federation, it's not a unitary state, it's not even a confederation, it's a community of states where each of these states seeks to pool its sovereignty towards certain clearly defined goals. And the four central pillars in CARICOM are, first of all, to build economic integration, and the phase which we are at is to build a Caribbean single market and economy. We have we have many single market aspects and one or two single economy features, but it hasn't built out fully yet, but we have done important work in that regard. Secondly, functional cooperation on a range of things in education, in health and the like. And you see the virtues of that in the recent period with COVID, the role of the Caribbean Public Health Agency, for instance, the CDMA, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. In the case of St. Vincent, additionally, the Seismic Research Center station at St. Augustine, UWI, deals with volcanoes and the like. So the second is functional cooperation. The third is the coordination of foreign policy as far as practicable. And fourthly, security coordination. And important work has been done in each of those areas. You take, for instance, the way in which we have engaged the WHO, the World Health Organization, and PAHO on a matter which is deep in our Caribbean, the question of the non-communicable disease of diabetes and hypertension. We had a special session at the General Assembly devoted to this, where heads of government from all over the world addressed this and gave it a certain profile and made more resources available to fight in this. Then there are matters in relation to small arms, which is a big issue in security. Trinidad and Tobago played a lead role for us in us having a small arms treaty coming out in the United Nations system. We have in the CARICOM in economic integration, tariff removals, free trade, protection of certain industries, freedom of movement for particular categories. It hasn't gone as far as some would like it to go, but we have had progress in coming together. And we have worked together on making representations towards issues which are challenges in the financial system. For instance, the question of cutting off correspondent banking relations. We have raised the issue of, as a category, and certainly St. Vincent and the Grenadines, small island exceptionalism as an important category, and for the building of a unit, what Roald Prescott was alluding to, not to use per capita GDP calculations, but to look at, to build a vulnerability index. So I would say that on security questions, the regional security system, the implementing agency for crime and security, and the coordination of those, and very critically for citizens, the building within the CARICOM framework, within the integration frameworks, the authoritative voice of the Caribbean Court of Justice in its original jurisdiction to address issues touching on concern in the treaty interpretation and conflicts between states within the context of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. So I will say that those are areas in which we have done very important work. And I think the CARICOM has advanced institutionally our Caribbean civilization. But it's always a real struggle. And I want to say this too, that in Eddie Green, Professor Green had mentioned earlier about St. Vincent and Grenadines being on the Security Council. The smallest country ever to be elected. We won the elections in June 2019 at the General Assembly. There are 193 countries. We got 185 votes. Our competitor got 6, and there were 2 abstentions. Our competitor came from Latin America, so we're representing the GRULAC group, the group of Latin America and the Caribbean. Couldn't have done so without the work which CARICOM does all the time, and though St. Vincent carried the banner, CARICOM was always there with us, or at least certainly in the last couple of years in this 10-year battle, 10-year struggle to have a seat on the Security Council. And ourselves, the linkage which we have made with Africa as the 6th region of Africa, all of these things which are taking place in the context of CARICOM. And at the beginning of the COVID, Prime Minister Rowley made a point that saying that the essential antidote to COVID is for us in the region on the fundamental issues to work together. And I think he is right about that. And we have done a lot of very important work together in relation to COVID, and we're still doing, particularly now we're at the vaccine stage, where there are challenges in entering the source markets. And clearly at this phase, CARICOM is focused on jabs and jobs, JABS and JOBS. In relation to what students in the social science should be looking at, well, there are a host of research issues in the region to real challenges. But sometimes I don't find that we do work. You take students in the field of economics. To the best of my knowledge, we haven't had any of the university professors or any of the graduate students doing an analysis of CLICO and BICO. In the Eastern Caribbean alone, in the OECD, in the Eastern Caribbean's currency union countries, CLICO and BICO, their demise caused a severe problem to people. And to the extent that their liabilities arising from the currency union countries amounting to 16% of our GDP as a consequence of the collapse of CLICO and BICO. That's a big number, a huge number. Imagine that, but there's been no study on it. Arising also from CLICO and BICO, there are people, civil servants, other persons who are retired, and other people put their money in these instruments, some of them are not particularly insurance instruments, and put all the money that they had. And then when they collapse, these are people with middle income, and they're depending on this investment and the returns to see out their sunset years. But they're now in a stage really of what one may call genteel poverty. None of the sociologists, as far as I know, none has addressed this phenomenon. I'm giving examples. In the area of the banana industry collapsed. Well, when we were supplying bananas to the United Kingdom, and people tend to forget that after the Second World War, when you had a Marshall Plan in Europe, And bananas were in Germany, which was the defeated country, because the Americans put a lot of money in Germany. The British didn't have the same access to the dollars. They had pounds. So they paid for our bananas in pounds. There was a subsidy involved there. But when you had the free trade regime being established and Britain entered the common market, and the bottom dropped out of the banana industry because it couldn't compete with Latin America and banana producers in West Africa. Something during the partnership between ourselves and Britain, where we, because of the subsidy, this banana green gold, farmers planted in the OECS and in Jamaica above the 1,000-foot contour, chopping down trees and the like. And you had a lot of spraying. The plastic covering the banana, the bunches of the bananas on the plant, they're coming down into the river. They're going down into the river and going and go around the necks of the turtles in the sea. A lot of environmental degradation. But nobody has studied what has been the environmental cost to bananas and how we can share that cost with our partners, the British, for example. We are at the moment making great demands for reparatory justice, but we don't have the lawyers in the Caribbean, including at the university, doing the research work to see how is it that we can best approach this question juridically, in addition to the issues of politics and the like. And diplomacy. How do we approach this juridically? How do we go to the International Court of Justice? Has any of them written us an opinion? What is the research work has been done? And there's a lot of what is lacking there, even though we have the good historical data. Beckles, Britain's Black Death and the like, and subsequent work. And then broadly, in the field of political economy, there are many, many things to be addressed. So you ask me the question, I give a wide range of particular subjects, and there are more, but we just have to look around us. Sometimes things which are before our very eyes, we don't see. I mean, there's a Nobel Prize winner in Europe, from Europe, won the Nobel Prize late 1980s or 1990, Elias Canetti. You may be familiar with him. He has written a lot of stuff on crowds and the like. He has a very interesting book called Air Witness. We normally talk about eyewitness. He speaks about air witness. Words and air witness. He won the prize for literature. And he made a point that there is a peculiar thing about intellectual curiosity. We look at things very far, and it's exciting. But things immediately before us, which we need to understand better, we don't go for them. So that is what I would want to suggest. Look, as a practitioner in dealing with CLICO and BICO, we had to develop our own expertise in-house in the public service to deal with this matter. There's no way I could turn to otherwise. That would be my broad answer to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
We just have one more question. Honorable Prime Minister Richard Mon, you can go ahead.
Good evening, Honorable Prime Minister, lecturers, students all, and those who are guests on the forum. I believe indeed we need to have a people-centered vision for our country, and generally when we look at what is happening around the world, it seems to have a people-centered approach to the whole issue of the 2030 agenda and developmental goals. When we consider a statement that I believe I heard during your lecture, whereby poverty elimination should not be substituted for economic development. How do we deal with the issue of balancing between what we do for economic development and seeking to achieve the developmental goal of alleviating poverty? How do we compromise to make sure we have economic development and not be compromising the outcome of achieving the goal of eliminating poverty within the near future? Thank you.
We're not hearing you, Honorable Prime Minister.
I said, at the time when I said this, I was quoting Carrie Levitt, where she said, poverty alleviation is no substitute for development as a social project of all citizens. No, you're quite correct. As a practical matter, and I've dealt with that very much in St. Vincent and Grenadines, where poverty reduction is one of our major goals, and zero hunger. And the number one within the 17 Sustainable Development Goals to be achieved by 2030. You have to do targeted specific interventions in relation to the poor, while at the same time addressing the sustainable development of citizens themselves. In other words, while you help people with a safety net, you need very much, while you're helping them with a safety net, you need to educate their children. You need to have them become productive citizens, but they don't fall below a particular level. They have a roof over themselves, their heads. They can eat. They can have the basic needs, necessities of life, while at the same time building a future. And you can have, in the same quotation, she correctly said that economic growth must be subordinate to long-term sustainable development. So she's on the same wavelength as you are. Because the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which replaced earlier the Millennium Development Goals, that they set for us particular goals and their multiplicity of actions in each of them. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, for instance, when we arrived in office, poverty was 37% of the population, and indigence was 26%. Indigence meaning dirt poor. So we set about to address the issue of indigence and poverty. By 2008, 2009, generalized poverty had come down from 37% to about 30%. But critically, indigence had moved from 26% to under 3%. But there was nevertheless an intractable element of poverty where we had to set up a zero hunger trust fund in order to fight this particular battle. And then, of course, look, climate change, even as you're dealing with poverty and you lose so much of your GDP through weather events, and all the climate change issues, the costs are horrendous. And you have to divert resources from one area to the next, that the poor suffer greatest as a consequence of climate change. So you have to, the deleterious effects of climate change. So we have to go with targeted specific interventions, while at the same time putting things in place to develop everybody and to lift the country as a whole. They are intricately intertwined. It can't be otherwise. And it is not easy. It is not easy. And now with COVID, every country in the Caribbean, in every country in CARICOM, save and except Guyana, has had a decline in the economy last year. And after Guyana, which had a positive growth, the one which declined least was St. Vincent and the Grenadines, just under 4%. And the collection of revenues in almost every country, other than Guyana again and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, our revenues last year increased, well, basically stable, flat, about 1% over 2019. And that's because we had 3 good months in January, February, March, before the pandemic, and we didn't lock down like some other countries. And our economy is more diversified, not as heavily dependent on tourism as, say, Antigua and Barbados and St. Lucia. So different things, and it's and now this year is probably going to be, there are countries which lost 30% of their revenues last year, 35%. In January this year, our revenues went down by 27% over January 2020. It is rough. There's no question about it. And that is why I'm emphasizing so much the role of social capital in helping us hold this thing together. And in this particular period, which is a special period, to focus on in relation to jobs, to focus on the construction. And the construction industry is where we get a lot of money from overseas in one form or another. For instance, grants, soft loans, some foreign direct investment, and some local investment in construction, in houses and the like, in agriculture, in fisheries, in medical cannabis, and in yachting, because the rest of the tourism sector is gone, and we keep our ports open, properly regulated, but we keep them open nevertheless. So it's not an easy time. In fact, to quote Martin Carter, from a different context, the faces of men and women are strained and anxious. And we have all of this, plus the ongoing challenges of monopoly capitalism and the instability which is taking place outside. Yet we hold it together in the region at a fairly high level of human development, according to the Human Development Index. May I just say, I don't want to provide readings for you all which you all are very familiar with, because they're all in the subject, the catalog of the library. But there are 2 books written by 2 members of the cabinet of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. One of them, the title is very appealing to younger persons. It's called Globalized, Climatized, Stigmatized. It's written by the Minister of Finance, Camilo Gonsalves, who happens to be my son, my firstborn son. This was written, published in 2019. It was one of the books towards the towards our our Security Council work. And there's a book I have, including a lead essay called Our Caribbean and Global Insecurity, where some of the issues I talked about here. You can find these on Amazon. And I quoted the Arthur Lewis lecture of Kyrie Levitt. It's in this book called Economic Theory and Development Options for the Caribbean. The Sir Arthur Lewis Memorial Lectures, 1996 to 2005, published by the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. The late Dwight Venner, a colleague of mine at university, was the governor. He has an introduction, and I have a foreword to the book, but it has essays by Rex Nettleford, Norman Gervin, Alistair McIntyre, Lloyd Bess, Kyrie Levitt, Mario St. Rose, Gerald Mayer, who is a big development economist, Alan Blinder, another big one, C.Y. Thomas from Guyana, and Joseph Stiglitz, who is a Nobel Prize winner in economics, former chief economist at the World Bank. So I don't, the other more general texts, you will have them, but I just thought that I will make reference to those. To show you, I didn't get the name of the professor who asked me the first set of questions, but you ask about people with different, and I'm sure that Angie here will tell me if you say it again. Saintville. All right. You take this book, Globalized, Climatized, Stigmatized by Camilo. If I were to write this, globalized, full stop, climatized, full stop, stigmatized, full stop, I find that a little difficult to write because I think sentences must have subject and verbs, and they must have some other long, but you know, this is the new generation. And I would have called it the political economy of globalization and climate change. But that's what it is about. And he addresses the question of small island exceptionalism, which is an interesting category, which he has elaborated on, with something which we talk about all the time in our political economy, in our government. And it has certain practical consequences in our foreign policy. I didn't want to sound pedantic, but in as much as you have students, I thought I'd give some reading material.
Thank you, Honorable Prime Minister. Richard, I see you still have your hand up. Is it you have a comment or you forgot to take it down?
All right, thank you. One other question I had for the Honorable Doctor, as it relates to taking advantage of the global world and building our people capacity. Small countries and developing countries within our region, I believe the helping our citizens to develop skill set to benefit from the drawbacks of the global world is important. How can we secure finances towards technical vocational education and training programming that will help to develop our citizens to benefit from the global economy? Thank you.
Oh, it's a fantastic question. It is one which preoccupies my attention. If I may just make this point. In the year 2050, of course, by then I'll be dead. because I've lived far more years than I have remaining left to live. I don't have many more remaining on this side of eternity. You're going to find many jobs which have been done now are going to be done by robots. Done by human beings are going to be done by robots. It's already taking place. Automation and the workplace is going to be vastly different than it is today. They're going to be even certain kinds of surgeries would be done through AI, artificial intelligence. A lot of services which are going to remain are going to be highly personalized and different sets of skills. Now, so we need skills at all levels. We need the highly professional skills in engineering, information technology, and the like. But you're still going to need people to do your electrical work. You're going to need people to do your plumbing. You're going to need chefs. I'm just giving examples. So they're all. And while our CXC exams are important for us to have a base in understanding concepts and ideas and give us skills of literacy and numeracy and basic IT skills and the like, and an understanding of the world around us, we have to build practical hands-on skills. There are areas which are available at the moment. There is a program financed by DFID, the Department for International Development. Well, it's now inside of the Foreign Office in Britain. It's a £9 million program in the 4 Windward Islands. It's based in St. Vincent, where over the next 3 years, there'll be some 2,700 about 2,000 Vincentians in overall about 7,000 in the 4 countries in the Windward Islands, who will be trained in all sorts of different things, practical hands-on skills. And we just simply have to develop strong technical vocational education, but not to treat technical and vocational education as the domain for those who have less cerebration, because you need a lot of thoughtfulness in handling this particular area, and to enter very much so the international labor market, the chain of the labor market. We spend a lot of resources, for instance, on nurses. We produce more nurses than we actually need. We actually pay our nurses to go to nursing school. We pay them $400 a month in addition to giving them either a free or highly subsidized nursing education, because we need nurses all over the world. And hitherto nursing might have been a middle-class profession, but it is because we open it up. So the question which you have raised is a vital one, and it's connected to the first question you talked about. That is to say, you address poverty alleviation programs with targeted specific interventions, but you have to have a development of the individuals themselves. And one of the ways you have to do that is to give them skills and to provide the resources. And very often in my country, I have been fortunate that the people have bought into what I'm talking about here, and they've given me a long run, 5 terms. But there's always a temptation to, when you're doing some of these things, to think of more election gimmicky things now. because the returns from education is a long, we're beginning to see the returns now. But it's long term. But you can't really have sustainable development unless you have real critical infrastructure being built of all kinds, education and health, education at all levels, and health, and housing, basic things, which also connect to the overall development of a country. Meanwhile, building proper institutions, to provide good governance, really. It's all part of the same package. And what I have found, if I may say this, is that very often you find us in the Caribbean, despite what some critics may say, and opposition politics and all the rest of it. But we have pretty good high levels of freedom of the press, of participation by people in the political process and so on. Higher levels than many developed countries. And there's a great ethos which is developing in the region on these matters. And of course, the revolution in information technology has assisted in this, though there are downsides to that too, because they can add to a democratic deficit by a lot of falsehoods. Well, if you're in the business as long as I have been, I just continue. I don't bother what you say about me, so I just continue and do my work. I bother only to the point of responding where it is necessary and desirable politically. Otherwise, you can't get anything done, given the cacophony of noises which there may be. But in that very cacophony of noises, and you educate people, you find the spaces to push your progressive agenda, though it is not easy, because you have pushback with a lot of backwardness coming out of the United States, especially in the deep south of those United States.
Thank you, Honorable Prime Minister. And just one final question before we have the closing remarks. It's coming from Ms. Sutherland from University of the West Indies. Ms. Sutherland, you can go ahead.
I don't think that my brother Sutherland has heard you.
Oh, unmute her, Joe. 1 second, we have the technician to unmute her.
Oh, I see. Oh, it's a lady. It's a comrade sister.
I think you can go ahead now, Shaniko.
Thank you. Good night to you, PM, and to everybody else. A good night.
Good night to you.
So for me, is that reality which sorts of puts everything on an international stage, including small island developing states like ours. And the reality for us is that we struggle to compete on this international stage and therefore to get the level of development that we need to get from our participation in international trade. Having said that, globalization is pervasive. It's deeply embedded in the global architecture through institutions like the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, etc. So therefore, we sort of have to make the best of it. It's here to stay and we have to make the best of it. Having said that, to what extent do you think our participation in regional trade agreements, such as the EU CARIFORUM EPA, provide us with an opportunity to truly benefit from this globalization that is here to stay, or to truly access that level of development that we need to from our participation in international trade? And what do you think that we should be doing differently to get more benefit from these regional trade agreements? Or what have we done correctly so far that has allowed us to benefit from globalization?
Well, I think in relation to the EPA, it's a partnership agreement which is trade and development. And broadly speaking, the terms in the agreement are skewed largely in certainly up to now in favor of the Caribbean, theoretically. But the spaces where we don't export a lot to Europe. And the developing areas where we can get, and we do get some resources, some export earnings, is in the area of culture and entertainment, the arts. You take a fellow like Skinny Fabulous. Are you familiar with him? He's an entertainer from St. Vincent. He's in the Buju Banton style, you know, that sort of music. In any one year in Europe, Skinny would have 40 gigs. And through the work on the issue of, you get Schengen visa waivers. You don't have to every time go to get a visa to go, you know. So there are niches like those. There are particular areas, Caribbean rum, of course, tourism services, they're there, they stand on their own because we're very competitive in that particular area. But we don't sell any more bananas. We don't sell sugar. In fact, Guyana produces sugar basically in the region. What you have had happening though, where we are suffering terribly with Europe, is in order of financial services. Because as I indicated, we are seen as having a harmful tax regimes. And though we have an inclusive process through the OECD and the Financial Action Task Force, there is not an inclusive process in the European Commission. And they make determinations, and because of their sheer power, they cut from under us an area of activity where we would have had at least a competitive advantage. You take Barbados. The middle class in Barbados was built to a considerable degree, the professional class, middle class, on the backs of the international financial services. With the diminution in those services, I've been advised that Barbados lost in foreign earnings over a 10-year period nearly $2 billion Barbadian dollars. That's about $200 million Barbadian per year. It doesn't matter which government is in power. And you notice the problem faced Frondel Stewart and his administration. It faced Mia. Mia sought to take a particular approach to see if her administration could get ahead of the curve. And they changed the goalposts. It's as though they have an interest in crushing all international financial centers in the Caribbean. That is not inside any treaty arrangement. That is outside of the treaty arrangements. Because I just say, we have an arrangement with the FATF. We had, even though the IMF, they have, at least the IMF has some rules, but the European Commission, they just dictate it. And they issue their blacklist. And you have very little say. I noticed there's a review which is going on in relation to the last blacklist on the Barbados. But it's a terrible thing. And they did that to Barbados in the middle of the COVID pandemic. There are all of these lessons which we have to learn. So it's not only, my dear comrade, Sister Sutherland, in the formal arrangements, it's those in which you're not even part of. The way in which corresponding banking relations are cut. If your corresponding banking relations are cut, the way this will happen is that, let's take in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The Bank of St. Vincent and the Grenadines is about 60% owned by the state. The government plus the NIS, the National Insurance Services, which is a state entity. A lot of workers' money in that. A lot of NIS money in that, National Insurance Services. Fortunately, we don't have a blacklist on us. But if you had a corresponding banking relationship cut with the Bank of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but you can turn a good, prosperous bank into essentially not a commercial bank with exchange relations, but a domestic savings bank, which would put our workers' resources in jeopardy. Because you wouldn't be able to do the kind of business and do the kind of investments which the bank is expected to do. These are hard-nosed practical questions. So very often, this is why I say, in relation to globalization, aspects of it, you have to make accommodation. And in other aspects, where you can resist, you resist. And you build alliances to do resistance. And you find some creative responses, but on several questions you have to make accommodations. But that's making accommodations, resisting and acting creatively. It's a different thing altogether than just simply say, look, I have to surrender, I can't fight this thing. Because I can't fight it day by day with Jesus. There's no other way, no other choice. Otherwise, we would abandon our right to development. And we would have abandoned our right to our independence and sovereignty and have a space called a Caribbean civilization. I hope I make myself clear. It's not an easy project where you have to maneuver. But you have to, I always make this point. And sometimes when I make accommodations, that accommodation is not the destination. You know, we have a mountain called La Soufrière, it's our highest peak. I can't climb, nobody can climb Lasso Frere in a straight line. You have to take zigs, you have to take zags. But you have to make sure when you do any of the zigs or the zags, you don't end up in a cul-de-sac. Though the shortest distance between 2 points, geometrically is a straight line. You can't climb it in a straight line. And if you try to, you're gonna fail. This is where leadership is important and judgment. You have to apply your heart to wisdom and always keep in communion with people. And we have to build this thing called the social capital. And we have to work hard and smart and disciplined every single day. Otherwise, we're going to be left behind. And this is why it can't be done by slogans. It has to be done by serious thought and research. And that's why I want to see, in the case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we are on target for 1 college university graduate per household by the year 2030, on an average. Put a lot of money in it, plenty money. And I invested in young people. There's no other way. While we do what we have to do in many other little areas, and I say, we make compromises. Without being compromising, we accommodate, but we resist where we have to resist, and we do things creatively. Professor Green, Eddie Green knows this very well. This is the way we gotta survive this hostile world and thrive, survive and thrive. But I want to say to all the students who are listening, there's nothing which is going to beat you sitting down and reading and studying and analyzing and looking for creative ways to do old things better and to do some new things which are not thought of before. And we have the brain power. We have the brain power. We just have to make sure we do it and do it in a context. But then I am when I talk about COVID, for instance, from the beginning, I talk about COVID-19 as a health, economic, social, which includes education and security issue. You have the courts just jailed a young Jamaican who came into the country since taking advantage of the 6 months, where a citizen a citizen of CARICOM can come in for 6 months within the framework of the rules and the Shani Myri case. And he had to plead guilty. The police found him with an assault weapon, a prohibited weapon under the law, with 60 rounds of ammunition. He came in basically to kill people. Higher than that, 60 rounds. 6 persons died so far for us from COVID. They had pre-existing conditions, comorbidities. But one man with 60 bullets can kill 10 times of the people who died from COVID over a whole year. And that's why we need the institutions to take care of that kind of thing. And for us to have the social capital to build our country. No, I didn't say Jamaica because it's not an anti-Jamaican point I'm making, because you probably have one or more criminal types who have left St. Vincent, taking advantage of COVID and gone to Grenada or gone to Trinidad or gone to Guyana. I don't know. It hasn't been reported to me. So I'm not claiming anything special in that regard. But all of these are issues which we have to face on a day-to-day basis while we are dealing with this large question of globalization and how to negotiate in it, to find spaces for us to make our way in this world. At the end of the day, we have ourselves. And I always tell our people in this country, although we are not better than anybody, nobody is better than us. And the young people who are at the University of Guyana, you have a future if you take advantage of the opportunities which exist. It's going to be tremendous. Same thing in St. Vincent or any other Caribbean country. But you can't be lazy, you know, and don't think that, well, Ralph is an old man. You know, none of you love to fet like me, you know, and a big Daddy Uroy died a couple of days ago, and I was on the radio asking them to play Daddy Uroy music. You know, it's part of our civilization. You have to work harder, you have to work smart, you have to work in a disciplined manner. And keep your head on.
Thank you very much for that, Honorable Prime Minister. I think we're now about winding up, and we have Dr. Green. Just before I go to the Deputy Vice Chancellor for the closing remarks, do you want to say anything before we? You're muted, Dr. Green. Could you unmute Dr. Green?
Yes, I thought that there was nothing that I want to steal the thunder for Dr. Eiffel, who will say the closing remarks, but certainly I think that the lecture provided us with not only those dimensions of globalization that we have to treat with, but it also, and I think the schematic way in which the professor, the Honorable Dr. Prime Minister, treated the matter helped us to understand that globalization has been in train over 400 to 500 years in different dimensions. But I think the lesson that we learned is that, in fact, we can intervene in the Caribbean. The only thing that I believe needed to be emphasized more, that the CARICOM region has much to gain by some of the things that he referred to, for example, the collaboration through functional cooperation, which helps us to move along as a group, our foreign policy coordination. And I wanted to say that I believe that at the end of the 2-year stint of St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the Security Council, what I think we need to have are those lessons learned about how the Caribbean can pivot into the international, intervene in the international arena so that we make a collective difference. Because as you rightly said, Prime Minister, although you are partnering in the global arena, you're really operating in the geographic space of the Caribbean civilization. And therefore, I think the lesson we learned is how do we as a Caribbean region utilize the experiences that we gain through, for example, your experience in the Security Council to help us to advance, intervene, and make a difference in the global arena.
If I may just say this, and I don't want to prolong it, you know, historically, the Security Council has been preoccupied with issues, the traditional issues of war and peace and terrorism and the like. We became president of the Security Council for the month of November. And we decided to do some things with a difference. We mounted our signature event when we started our month as presiding over the Security Council. we had a session called Contemporary Drivers of Insecurity. Issues relating to COVID, climate change, because you don't normally think of these things as related to insecurity. Well, I believe that our presence on the council and the fact there are 3 countries from Africa, we have formed a nexus called the A3+1, the Africa 3+1. The +1 being St. Vincent and the Grenadines, representing the 6th region of Africa. And we have put these matters so close, so much on the forefront, that today, for instance, Boris Johnson, the United Kingdom, Britain is now the chair for this month of the President of the Security Council. And today, their signature event was climate change in conflict areas. The climate change as a security issue. Of course, there are some persons, there are some bigger countries don't want to touch that because they feel that you're moving away from some of the traditional issues dealing within the Security Council. But for us, climate change is a security issue of the first order. The COVID is a security issue for us. It's not just a health or economic issue or social issue, it's also a security issue. And for humanity. So in this way, we're helping to change some of the language and some of the concerns and preoccupations. It's a very interesting process. And it can't stop here, it has to continue. And I just want the women who are listening to know that 80% of our staff at the United Nations are women. And we have 3 persons of ambassadorial rank. The first one is our permanent representative who heads the mission. We have a woman who is ambassadorial rank also, who supervises the General Assembly work. But I got the University of West Indies to lend us someone, a Vincent. You probably know, familiar with her, Dr. Halima Dishang, who heads the Women's Development Unit at Cave Hill. Right. And I went out of the way to recruit her because 60% of the issues that come to the Security Council are related to Africa and are connected with issues concerning violence with children and women. Women as victims of war and children and the like. And helping to chart some new directions in some of those areas, even changing the nature of the language which is used. And would you believe it that St. Vincent and the Grenadines is chair of the Yemen Sanction Committee? We deal with Yemen. That issue is related to us. And we had the informal, very important informal group dealing with rules and procedures within the Security Council. And you can enter at certain points. It's almost mind-blowing, that a country of 110,000 people, of 150 square miles, and about 11,000 square nautical miles of seascape is in that situation. Absolutely incredible. And speaks towards our possibilities. It speaks towards those. Exactly the point you're making, Eddie.
Thank you so much, Honorable Prime Minister. So we go now to the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Dr. Melissa Eiffel, to bring the closing remarks. Dr. Eiffel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prescott. Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Honorable Dr. Ralph Gonsalves, Chancellor of the University of Guyana, Professor Eddie Green, other distinguished members of this virtual audience, UG and UE faculty and students, particularly those enrolled in the course BYD 2203. Good evening. Please allow me to express on behalf of the Vice Chancellor of the University of Guyana, Professor Paloma Mohamed Martin, the university's sincerest gratitude to Prime Minister Gonsalves for his extremely insightful and rich lecture and discussion on the topic globalization, regional and international perspectives. I have no doubt, the Honorable Prime Minister, that you have inspired our students to care even more deeply about our countries and our region, and indeed our world. I want to suspect that you might as well have inspired a few to gain some clarity with regard to a career path in politics. Mr. Raul Prescott, lecturer of the course under which this guest lecture has been organized, and the Faculty of Education and Humanities must be commended for being bold enough for making the overture and for staging this virtual event, which has no doubt resulted in our students and students from UE benefiting from Dr. Gonsalves' uniquely placed perspective, as he took a very long, historical, and wide-ranging view of the evolution of capitalism, with its attendant ills, both in the region, in the Caribbean, and as well in the world. The current COVID-19 pandemic has led to a surge globally in public cognizance of precisely how deeply we are all connected through global processes. Though, of course, this is not the first global health crisis that has exposed this form of globalization. As Dr. Gonsalves inferred, there are different manifestations of globalization that have different temporal characteristics. Some are long-term, upward trends, while others display large cyclical oscillations. And I want to urge our students, as you continue to examine the globalization discourse, to recognize that you are likely to see, as Dr. Gonsalves has indicated, contradictory interests of powerful and less powerful groups. And as you increasingly recognize and understand and examine our interconnectedness on multiple levels, I hope that your aim, indeed all our aims, would be to work towards the transformation of our region and the world into one that is more humane, democratic, just, balanced, and sustainable. Once again, Prime Minister Gonsalves, we at the University of Guyana, we express our deepest appreciation to you for your guest lecture today. Thank you to all our students for listening and for participating. And finally, please indulge me as I wish a happy 51st Republican anniversary to my fellow Guyanese. And in this uncertain environment, I urge us all to remain safe. Thank you very much, and I hope that you all have a very pleasant rest of the evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Honorable Prime Minister. It's a pleasure. Have a good evening, everyone.